Right, I've just restarted the recording. I think it's about time that we start. We've got around about 50% of the delegates we had registered for today's session have already joined, so thank you very much. As people join late, I will admit them. But thank you for joining us for today's session, which is the first UKGI live session and a planned calendar of events that will be rolled out over the next 12 months. This calendar of events will be headlined by both the autumn and spring seminar and webinar series that we run each year. And today, no surprises, we're talking about preparing for the Consumer Duty Board report, which on an annual basis, the governing body or equivalent for smaller firms of any regulated firm is expected to review and approve its assessment of the progress with all things consumer duty related, principally to evidence whether the firm is delivering good outcomes to their customers. So in this session, we're going to focus on the latest consumer duty developments, the requirements in relation to the board report, our insight as to how firms can perhaps approach the report and evidence pack required to present to your boards or most senior management. And we will look to provide some pragmatic guidance, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout. If you can do that in the Q&A, if we're not able to answer them live, then we will circulate a Q&A document afterwards, just conscious of time. So I'm Dave Anderson, Head of Technical for UKGI, and I'm joined by the lady on screen with me, who I'll let you do your own introduction, Emma.
Thank you, Dave. Hello, everyone. I'm Emma, and I'm a compliance consultant at UKGI. I've been here for 8 months now, and my background is in insurtechs and financial services.
And now an expert in the consumer duty. Let's not forget that.
Absolutely, don't forget that.
So covered in this session, we are, well, where are we at now? There's not long to go. A summary of what the board report should include. We're going to give some guidance around the monitoring and embedding evidence that may be required. There's going to be a bit of a focus on vulnerability, and we'll talk about why shortly. We're going to give some practical examples on presenting the issues, risks, and the work undertaken to meet Principle 12. First, you'll see in big letters on this slide, we're now heading rapidly towards the final consumer duty deadline of the 31st of July. That's going to be an ongoing requirement, but this is the first iteration. I can't express the urgency of making a start if you haven't done so already. Your data gathering should have begun, well, probably 12 months ago now, and there's just 35 days or 26 working days, 25 and a half if we're counting today, until D-Day, so that clock is very much ticking. A reminder that the overarching principle, the consumer principle, Principle 12, in the simplest terms, this is what your board report needs to prove how your firm has delivered good outcomes to its customers in relation. So where Principle 12 applies, Principle 6, customer interests, and Principle 7, communications with clients, are removed, and Principle 12 was introduced to impose a higher and more exacting standard. Emma, I think we discussed this, didn't we, the other day? It's important that firms remember that where the definitions in ICOBs are updated in relation to customer and policy stakeholder, that may have impacted where Principle 12 comes into play for firms, and where customers' outcomes for retail customers may need to be considered. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Here we've got the outcomes. By now, you should all surely be familiar with the 4 outcomes, so I'm not going to focus too much on those, but I'm going to be looking at the areas to the right. So they're on screen. All the key work today has been about ensuring those 4 outcomes are embedded and customers are achieving them. And importantly, if they're not, the appropriate controls are in place to ensure that it's been identified and is due to be acted upon and will be remediated. But as the FCA has mentioned, it's not a once and done exercise, so perhaps the picture shouldn't always be so rosy. But if we focus on 5 and 6, increasingly the FCA talks about the importance of firms' cultures as then being a key driver, not only in the consumer duty, but also improving firms' cultures being a key outcome of the consumer duty. The FCA's focus on culture can't be underestimated. Firms would be well advised to include commentary on culture as an outcome in the Consumer Duty Board report. And again, we will focus on that in the coming slides. And similarly, you'll see there's potentially a 6th outcome as well for vulnerable customers, although they should be considered across all elements of the duty, across all 4 outcomes, with the improvements in how firms identify and deal with vulnerable customers, they should be considered as another outcome of the consumer duty. So if your firm has improved the ways in which it identifies and deals with vulnerable customers, do include that as another outcome in the board report. That's something you can shout about, and we will focus on that in a few more slides as well.
So, what are the takeaways from the work that the FCA has done? Ask yourself, do you have robust records of the fair value assessments? Understand fair value? Have a process for identifying vulnerable customers and MI to enable assessment of their outcomes? Have evidence that you've reviewed your customer journey? But also some actions you should take as well. So revisit areas where the firm is lacking. Undertake a review of staff remuneration and undertake a review of costs and charges. So now we're going to look at the rules and the report. That's a good place to start, isn't it? So what have the FCA said about the board report? So it's an annual and reviewed by the governing body of the firm to approve the outcomes being received by customers. So boards must understand what outcomes customers are getting from their firm and products. If the firm doesn't have a governing body or defined board structure, the responsibility for the board report sits with the senior management, SMF holders, and if there is only one or two of you, well, unfortunately, it is all on you. So we also need to confirm if the firm is complying with the obligations under the duty. So the board needs to understand what those obligations are. Assess the future business strategy, if this is in line with consumer duty, embedding the culture of the duty into the everyday running of the firm. It's not an attestation. It will take time to pull together. 43% of attendees on a recent webinar are at the stage of describing the format they will use and defining the data and metrics. We expect the FCA to ask for these reports as one of the most interesting data gathering exercises they have ever done. No idea what that scale will look like or the complexity of what they're looking to do, but it is something that you may have to deal with, so it's worth preparing for that. If any of you are preparing for a sale in the near future, this would be a critical report that we would expect that would be asked for you as part of the due diligence that the potential buyer would be performing.
Similarly, just on that point, it's something that we're starting to see insurers ask of brokers as part of entering into any agreement with them, and in their annual reviews, what a firm's done to date in relation to preparing for the board report.
Absolutely, is a really, really key thing that everyone, FCA regulators, should really be focusing on. Absolutely. So, and remember, just do you. We're not all the same. No two businesses are identical, and you've got to make sure that it works for you as well. So there's no current view on what good looks like. Just an expectation that we as a sector are more on top of it than others, particularly where we think about other regulations that have come in or requirements under things like PROD as well. It must be completed no later than the 31st of July, and that's really, really important that you're doing that. Consider when your nearest board report is scheduled for, and make sure you're including it within the agenda for that meeting. It's also worthwhile thinking about doing a dry run with the board, so it's not something that's just thrust upon them. Make them aware of what's going on, and then you've got that opportunity to do it a second time and go from there. So in terms of who's going to be writing the report, the ownership should sit with first line or the chief operating officer if you have one. There should be contribution from second line with checking and challenging what goes into that report. And then third line are, in our view, on the journey towards auditing. Need to get used to the testing mindset and not auditing the process. Don't plan to achieve a green report this year. This is the first year of assessing progress. And so what we're looking at is how well is it embedded so far. There will be actions, or there might be actions that are red and amber, and I know that some boards and other people may be uncomfortable with that, but red and amber is not an indication of failure. It's an indication of progress against moving to an outcomes mindset. So see it as an opportunity to learn and develop rather than as being a negative. It should be supported by data metrics and examples or case studies proportional to your business. Think about quantitative metrics, so the evidence, as well as that qualitative commentary, so proves understanding. The non-executive and directors and consumer duty champions should be challenging it. Consumer duty champions should be the conscience and the internal mirror. It shouldn't be hundreds of pages long or supported by hundreds of pages of data. No one's going to want to read that.
On the consumer duty champion point as well, we've had a lot of questions around at what level that should sit, and I think in initial publications the FCA suggested it should be, an independent NED, an INED. That doesn't obviously apply, and it's not applicable wouldn't be suitable for most firms. It doesn't necessarily have to be an SMF, although it perhaps should, but it's perhaps the most senior person with a evidentiary oversight of how customer outcomes are being delivered, how the implementation went, that can also bring independent challenge to board level. And I think that's, whoever that person is within your business, then they're the right person to be the consumer duty champion. Emma, what should the board report actually include?
That's a very good question, Dave. We think about there being 4 key topics that we think should be covered as a minimum. And this will give you sort of our recommendation for the areas that should be included in the report. So the 4 areas that we think about here is going to be, firstly, the implementation of the duty. How well did this go? What have you learned from it? Things like that. Also think about the next step, which is going to be MI you're collecting and what outcomes monitoring is in place and how effective this is. And how does this evidence that you are meeting the 4 outcomes under the duty, and always link it to those outcomes as well. You might not have all the MI that you want to in place currently, but that doesn't mean you can't talk about what you're going to do in the future. So this additional MI that we're thinking about including within there. Think about that core one, the vulnerable customers. So is the board assured that they're being treated fairly and are receiving outcomes as good as other customers? And that's a really key point, is about vulnerable customers. But also think about the future business plan as well. How is this consistent with the requirements of the duty? And as we've said, there's no template for the report, and in our view, it's dangerous to rely on a template. It's going to be very bespoke and a personal report. So as we say, every firm is different. We can provide some structure around what areas need to be focused on and what questions the firm and the board need to be asking themselves. But also, one thing to think about here is ask yourself, what have you done over the last 12 months? It doesn't just have to be something you've done specifically for a customer. Could it be a change to your business that might actually be a good outcome for those customers? For example, we've had a firm that's recently had solar panels fitted, also upgrading their office security as well. Well, actually, that would help to reduce bills for the firm, which helps that financial integrity and ability to maintain the business. But also the added security to the offices means that customer data is more secure. So there's some really simple things that you might not think would go into this, but actually can. So remember to think about those. And we're going to talk about these in more detail on the following slides.
I reckon a few light bulbs went off then, Emma, definitely.
Hopefully.
Okay, consumer duty implementation. So let's look at, you should be looking at how the implementation of the duty went, what was done in the 12 months following the publication of the policy statement. Should reasonably provide a summary of what actions the firm took, what gaps were identified, how those gaps were identified, and what the plan was to resolve those gaps. How were they resolved? What the board needs to focus on is asking themselves key questions. You can use the FCA's 10 key questions from the publicised webpage and the 41 key questions that appear throughout the FCA's finalised guidance that was issued alongside the consumer duty policy statement. Ask yourselves, how good was the plan? Did you identify all the gaps? Were you honest with yourselves? How effective were the actions that you took to resolve those gaps? Can you do more? Should you do more? Probably yes in most cases, and that would be appropriate. Did you just tick boxes, or did you actually drive change in the business for the customer's benefit? Good example is, if you look at senior level, how many of you took the time to experience the customer journey from start to finish through the eyes of a client, and importantly, through the eyes of a client with potential vulnerability? And what did that tell you? Did that drive any changes? And did you record that rationale anywhere? How involved was everyone in the project? Was staff given sufficient training? Do staff understand their role in implementing the consumer duty and driving good customer outcomes? Has the board driven a culture change, or have they just sat back and let the project manager or compliance deal with it and not really been involved with the implementation? That perhaps wouldn't be the right approach and not something you should document. What went well? What can you showcase? What could you have done better? If you're doing it again, would you change anything? And it's key to evidence those responses. That's the ability for firms to document the information that's been shared at board level. It should be recorded in meeting minutes that can show the questions that were considered and the decisions that were taken at senior leadership level.
I'd add that also be honest with yourself, like what actually went well, what didn't. Be really honest about that. Wonderful. So MI and outcomes monitoring. So this is probably going to be the biggest part of the report. And it's also the area that most firms have struggled with. The FCA survey showed that 28% of firms found this aspect of the duty the most difficult to implement. Firms may wish to consider whether a summary of any case studies and the outcomes might be something the board would like to see included. So what should the MI monitoring process look like? What am I using to evidence meeting each outcome? How did you decide to use this as a measure? What KPI metrics are you using to decide if you're doing well or not? Was this an internal exercise or did you look at the industry? Think about lag and lead indicators. The FCA is hoping you will call out the gaps rather than waiting for your MI to tell you something has already happened, and you do not have the means to have already identified the possibility through lead indicators. Don't simply repackage what you've already relied on. It's unlikely to be enough. For example, evidence of e-learning is not going to be sufficient to prove competency in achieving a good outcome for customers. Aggregate the data. Consider that data alongside customer feedback, complaints, QA results, anything else that will give you the truer picture of competence to deliver good outcomes. And don't rely on a percentage as a measure when the true context is in numbers. The board needs to be able to review this information, ask themselves, does this process actually work? Is the data showing us what we need to see or just what we want to see? I.e., if we're actually not meeting an outcome, will we identify this fact from looking at the data? And if not, why can't we do that? This section also needs to provide a summary of what the results have been from the monitoring undertaken so far. Remember, it's been, well, pretty much 11 months now since implementation, so there should already be monitoring results to review. Summary of the actions taken if the firm has identified a failure to meet the outcome. So what should that summary look like? The board should be asking themselves, has this action been effective? A summary of any root cause analysis process. Has this been effective? Are we actually identifying what the root cause is? Or are we making assumptions? What evidence have we got from that root cause to tell us what is going on for our customers? Look at the breakdown of each of the 4 outcomes in this section. So considering what we have already mentioned about the FCA's concerns around firms' understanding of fair value, this is the opportunity to provide some detailed commentary on fair value and how this is being achieved, recorded and monitored by the firm. Remember, this is an area the FCA feels that firms are falling down. So it's important to ensure the report shows that the firm truly understands the concept of this. If you don't understand fair value, look for guidance. You can ask us for that. If you're a UKGI member, absolutely reach out to your consultant. Also, there's things like BEBA documentation that they've put together as well. So there's certainly places you can find information on what fair value is.
I think it's important to circle back to vulnerability and vulnerable customers as well. Probably, teed that up. We were going to labour on this quite heavily today, but it's another area that the FCA feels firms are falling down on. So like fair value, this section really needs to showcase your understanding of the concept and what you're doing to protect these customers. Firms should be asking themselves the question, okay, what percentage of our client base is vulnerable? Is it 10, 20, 50%? You need to really understand your client base as a demographic. If you deal primarily with commercial customers, you don't have to worry about vulnerable customers. That's wrong. Small and medium-sized commercial firms can be classed as vulnerable. Think about family-run firms where a family member may pass away, for example, or SME who lose a large contract and suddenly can't afford their overheads. That all falls into the concept of vulnerability, and boards need to assure themselves that these customers being correctly identified, when they are identified, that they're receiving as good outcomes as the other customers. And that means you should be able to compare the MI for vulnerable customers against that of other types of customers that you deal with. And if you can't do that, then you can't determine what outcomes these customers are getting. Ask yourselves what MI is available to demonstrate this. Where can you look? Does it come from complaints root cause analysis? Are customer care indicators captured through your systems? Where can you pull the information from? Do you have suitable training in place to allow staff to spot vulnerability and to identify where reasonable adjustments need to be made? Do you have processes in place to accommodate those reasonable adjustments that need to be made for those customers? And then how is that reported on? Are you able to extract that data? Is QA set up to identify where vulnerability has been, picked up and addressed? I was speaking to one of the consultants a couple of weeks ago, and they had a good example where they'd been on site and they'd done conducted a piece of consultancy where the firm were confident their customer base didn't lend itself to vulnerable customers or characteristics of vulnerability due to perception of financial status and the luxury element of the asset they wanted to insure. But they weren't able to provide any data around this. They didn't have a report that showed a number of vulnerable customers that had been identified. So it required a bit of digging, and they felt like they perhaps identified 6 vulnerable customers in the past 8 months, and 4 of which came from complaints and root cause analysis. So that reinforced some good practices there, but they was clearly missing a trick. And the more the consultant questioned them, the less confident the firm became that that number was right. So we put in place a short remedial exercise to retrain and reframe the understanding of vulnerability and potential vulnerability. And the running total after, it was less than a week, it was around about 3 days post that remediation, that total exceeded what was seen in the previous 8 months. So that's a massive success for the firm. Don't look backwards and think we weren't doing it right. That they've now taken massive steps to put that right, and that's something they can shout about in the board report. But more so, it's an amazing outcome. It's a success for their customers. Boards need to be honest about the answers to those questions. You can't just assume that everything is fine the way it is. If you can't evidence to the FCA that vulnerable customers are being treated fairly, then naturally they'll assume they're not. Remember, the FCA is going to be reviewing how well firms are, going on this subject. It is an area of particular interest. Even where firms primarily deal with large-scale employers, for example, in respect of group protection business, health, PMI, and employee benefit schemes, the approach to potential vulnerability has certainly been impacted through the rewording of those definitions of customer in many relevant ICOBS rules and much of ICOBS guidance, where those definitions of customer potentially include policy stakeholders now as well. And that comes into play where elements of products and services, from communications to any post-sale support, for example, if a firm interacts with individuals who might be making some form of claim, they all trigger the need for careful consideration of how vulnerability might feature, and beyond the scope of vulnerability to apply to the end user, customer, or policy stakeholder, it could just as easily apply to the individuals with which you deal with, who represent even the biggest of companies and corporations. So there's a lot to look at there.
So let's talk about the future business strategy. So the final section that we've outlined here would be that future business plan. So firms should be looking at their business plan annually and think about what changes they are going to make in the coming 12 months. This is an opportunity to ensure that the consumer duty outcomes are truly embedded within the business. The FCA have provided a set of questions on what boards should ask themselves when regarding this. If this is something we can support you with, we can absolutely do that. Remember to look at this section from all angles. So don't just think about the bottom line. Also consider customers, staff, culture, and where you can add value. Something as simple as having some company values shows that you've got a culture in place and the expectations you have on your firms to meet those, your staff, to meet those. What options do you have to create evidence? Who in the business needs to drive the culture of the duty forwards, and how will they do this? And do you have a consumer duty champion? If not, you should and need to identify who is providing that challenge.
So, key questions for firms, other than the 10 key questions that the FCA published on its webpage for the consumer duty, although if you look at it, there's actually 14 questions there, or the 41 questions that appear throughout the finalised guidance issued alongside the policy statement. You know, how do you prove you've mapped the data back to the outcomes? What did the outcome look like? Is there a gap, an action plan? Are you aggregating data? Are your lead and lag indicators sufficient, or can you continue to improve the information that's available to you? How do you know? What can you show me that you've considered? How can you prove? Proving it is key. How can you prove that you've mapped it back to the outcomes, and what was the result? If it was all good and all green, all gravy, it perhaps needs to be revisited. That shouldn't really be the case. If there were gaps identified, that's possibly a good thing. What actions were required, and even if it's red or amber, as Emma said earlier, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's what happens next and who will own it and drive those changes. That's what's important.
So let's look at an example for the action log. So when reviewing the report, the board should be asking themselves, what can we do to improve this? The FCA will not want to see reports where the answer to this question is nothing. There is always room for improvement. No one is perfect. The duty is designed to evolve with the firm, and compliance with this is not to be a static tick box exercise. Board should identify actions for improvement. These should be logged, followed up by the owners regularly, not just at the yearly review of the board report. Do that quarterly, monthly, however often you have those meetings. Ensure that you're reviewing those as regularly as possible. This document will provide an audit trail that will show the evolution of the culture in the firm. So with that in mind, the board may also want to consider undertaking a review of the firm's implementation of the consumer duty at firm level specifically. I recomplete the gap analysis done as part of the implementation and see if there is any areas that have been missed or could be improved upon. Think about giving it an action title, details of the action, severity rating, when it was identified. So what date did you identify that? Give it an action owner. Have a target completed date. Be realistic with that though. Don't think we're going to get it done within a month when actually you've got a significant amount of changes to make. Be realistic about that. Think about the status of the action, so make sure you're logging that as you progress. The date that you actually completed that action, when the board reviewed it, and when it was signed off by the board as well. So let's have a look at this example. So a customer had their vehicle vandalised. The customer had a sat-nav in their glove compartment, which they used when travelling with work, which had been taken from the vehicle when it was vandalised. The customer does not have another device capable of providing the same function, which affects their ability to work. When the customer logged a claim for the damage to the vehicle, they did not mention the sat-nav. The firm's claims department, when logging the claim, confirmed with the customer if anything had been taken, and that it could be covered under the policy. This outcome was a win for both the firm and the customer, providing much needed support during a vulnerable period and a better outcome. To address this, the firm actually took steps to better educate both their customers and staff, and this enhanced the understanding and helped customers realise how and when they might benefit from their policy, even in situations where they might not initially connect the dots.
They're probably the kind of things that are happening organically within your business's day to day, that, you know, if you reframe how you look at them and document your approach to them, you can showcase and shout about how you're driving better outcomes for customers.
And the final example, I'm not going to go into as much detail on this one, but just to give you a bit of an overview of it. So the issue here was when the board reviews the business strategy and plan through a consumer duty outcome lens, and they identified some customer shortcomings within their process. So the process over the outcome. So what they've done is they've updated their business plan and strategy, which evidence the changes that they propose to make over the next 3 years. And that's about being proportional as well. You don't think you can do it straight away. Think about how much time it is realistically going to take you to solve that problem and work from there.
And if you can do that, that will very clearly evidence a governed and considered approach to monitoring implementation and changes that are required to outcomes under the consumer duty. So I'm really conscious that we've gone through an awful lot of information in a very short time, and we could reasonably have spent the entire day talking about the consumer duty. We're going to try and do a bit of a summary for you today. So what actions do you need to take away following this session? We'll start working on this now, if you haven't already, but I imagine everyone already has something underway. Consider your timing. Which board meeting will this be reviewed in? Add it to the agenda now. You're running out of time to be able to do that. Try and fit in a dry run. Be comfortable that the board understand this report will likely not indicate a full suite of green metrics. If you're already under some form of interaction or scrutiny with the FCA, remember, if you do that, it's likely to create more probing. Remember, this shouldn't be the destination. This is still the tail of the journey, as cheesy as that sounds. Ensure you have an updated business strategy, and this has taken the consumer duty into account. Engage with the business, start collating the data that you need to write the report, and that should already be underway. If not done already, make sure you've defined your KPI metrics for meeting the outcomes and apply these to the MI that you have available. And if you need help, speak to us. We have a framework and we have support that is available to you. Not had any questions come through on the chat. If there are any questions that you would like to send through to us afterwards, we can happily pick up, and we'll happily talk through those with you after today's session. For now, I think that's thank you from me. And
from me.
Look at that timekeeping, Emma.
It was perfect timing, Dave. I'm very impressed with us.
Punch you up for professionals. Don't miss our next Lunch and Learn webinar. We're going to keep these coming thick and fast now, so possibly not surprised given how heavily it's featured in today's session. But we're going to be looking at customer vulnerability. That's going to be on the Thursday, the 13th, Thursday, the 18th of July, same time, same place. But do watch your inbox and LinkedIn for details of how to register for that session. And thank you very much for joining us. I hope you have a fabulous day, everyone.